Okay. So today's demonstration, you can see me in there. Yeah.
Sure.
So for today's demonstration, I'm going to do a two-part press mold, which is not the same as a slip cast mold. I've got a bunch of slip cast molds back here to kind of show you guys the idea. So this is slip cast mold, and how these are used are this is a camel. You guys see that? Oops, right side up. Okay, so this is a camel. These are rubber banded or strapped together, right? So they're held together. Pour liquid clay or casting slip into it. The plaster is hydroscopic, which means what? Do you guys know what hydroscopic means?
Doesn't it suck the water out?
Sucks the water out. So if something's hydroscopic, it means it's seeking moisture, right? So like the casting slip is clay and a lot more water than like regular like workable pinchable clay, right? It's got something in there called a deflocculant usually to keep those particles suspended in that water. And then the plaster sucks the moisture out, and you're left with a skin essentially, right? That's up against the plaster, so you have that, but you have to dump out the casting slip after a certain amount of time, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a half hour, or hour, depending on how thick you need your cast to be. But for what we're going to do in this class, we're actually going to make a press mold, which is similar. It's going to be two parts, but we're not so concerned about having a reservoir here, right? In casting slip, you need to have a reservoir so that it has extra slip in it. So once the moisture is absorbed, the level of slip starts to drop right inside of this when you are casting it. So you need to make sure you have reserve slip. It also helps protect that area wherever it is that wherever the reservoir is, and you can clean that area up usually really easily. But for what we're doing, we actually don't need to do that because we're going to be pressing slabs of clay into our molds, and then getting out our forms from that. Does that make sense? Yeah.
If we want to do slip molds, are we going to be able to?
Yes. Yeah, so if you want to do slip casting, totally fine. Slip casting is just kind of like a few degrees more challenging. There's definitely a few more things you need to know. So I'm not going to cover all those right now, but I'm just going to talk about this. So you need to make a mold, and you need to make a mold of something that you've made out of clay, preferably just our regular sculpture clay, or cheap clay. So I took the liberty of spending some time today of making this really cool little tombstone. So the benefits of making a mold of something is I can now, if I make something solid, this is solid by the way, if I make something solid, I can really manipulate that form. I'm not too encumbered by the rules of ceramics, like it needs to be thin here and thick there to support this thing. This is a really basic form. You guys can go much more dynamic than this because you can keep it solid, right? You can have thick spots and thin spots. And then the great thing about a press mold is, I've got the mold, I'm working with the mold while it's open, and I'm pressing the clay into it, okay? And I can really dictate where the thick and thin spots are, and I can kind of feel that as I'm working and pushing the slab into the piece, right? And I can go kind of thin with it usually. That way I can make a really very craftily made object. So it's usually a better object in the end, and I can make multiples of it, right? So if I got a mold of it, like this camel, for instance. We could make 100 camels, before this mold started breaking down, probably. So the benefit is then you can make multiples of that object. So yeah, that's also part of the assignment. You're gonna be making five of the pieces from your mold. So you gotta think about what that might look like in the end. How interesting is it to have 5 of this thing, and how you can do different surfaces on each piece. It's glossy glazes or maybe no glaze at all, washes, paint. So I'm going to kind of let you guys run free with that, kind of explore that a little bit more with this. So that's that'll be what you'll be working on. So, I made this piece, let it sit out in the sun for about 3 or 4 hours. Made it this morning, before noon, and so it's like a lot before, so it's been sitting out in the nice, San Jose sun. It's not really that pinchable in the thinner areas. In the thicker areas, you can kind of push the clay in a little bit. So it's pretty stiff, right? This is what I would call like late leather hard. So this is a really good time to actually apply plaster to this. So it's going to maintain its form, and also the plaster won't stick to it. Okay, that's kind of the beauty of working with clay and making a mold from clay, is that you're not worried about the plaster sticking to it. And if it does stick to it, you can always like scrape it out once you pull the mold off, right? Like if clay sticks to the plaster, I'll just let the plaster sit and cure. I can take a wet sponge to it and I can wipe that clay out. Does that make sense? Yeah, so like if you are making a mold of something that's like, a family heirloom or a family like artifact, I don't recommend that, because there might be a possibility that the plaster gets into the piece and like ruins it, or your piece breaks off when you're pulling the plaster away from it, right? So with this, it's much more manageable, and there's a lot less risk involved. So that's why I think this is a really good starting point for mold making in clay. So what I want to do now is I'm going to apply, I'm going to go ahead and apply what's called mold soap. So the main mold soap that we like to use in our studio, because it's really easily available. You can get this I buy this at Target, Home Depot, Lowe's, Walmart, wherever. Murphy's Oil Soap, it's great. So I usually will apply this either with a sponge or I spray it on. So we have a spray bottle over here that is already loaded up with Murphy's Oil Soap. So this is perfect. Gets into all the like little nooks and crannies. So I'm going to spray this with this, and then I'm going to create a little wall around here, because I need to think about this. This is where the little handout comes in that I gave to you guys about undercuts and where to divide objects. This object's really easy to divide visually. I'm just looking for the apex of this outer line, right? There's definitely like a front and back to this piece, okay? The items that you might be making might not look like that. Some of the items you're making might not really be appropriate for this, so that's something else we need to have a conversation with before you begin this project. Is whether or not it's good for like a 2-part press mold. It's best if the piece or the mold can like come apart, right? And that the plaster does not sink in any undercuts, right? So there's no undercuts really on the front and back of this, and I can easily divide this into a front and back, so I can make those two sides. Does that make sense? Okay. That handout we'll go over in a little bit once we're done like videoing this. But what I want to do right now, I'm going to go ahead and spray this. Or actually, you know what? I take that back. I'm going to go ahead and actually divide this. So according to like our that handout, you really want to make sure that wherever I divide this, I'm going to create this little wall here. Wherever I divide this, it needs to be kind of like at the outermost point, what I call like the apex of the object. Because like whenever you look at any like plastic bottles, glass bottles especially, you'll see like seams on those, because those are made in special molds, right? That come apart. If you look at the handout, I said we're going to look at it later, but I guess we're going to look at it now. If you have over half of an object, if we look at like this middle on the front on page 1 of this, if you have a bottle like over halfway down into plaster, you're not going to be able to actually get that bottle up because the plaster is coming around the outermost point, right? Does that make sense? And if we're doing a 2-part mold, then you have to be pretty accurate about like where those mold parts meet, right? Where those walls meet, because again, you might get that piece like stuck inside the mold, right? Like with like silicone molds and rubber molds, like that's not as much of an issue. When we're making plaster molds, that is. Okay, so you have to be really aware of like undercuts. So we'll go over this a little bit more in detail. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and kind of divide this on its outermost point. I'm just going to kind of draw on it. take clay, I'm gonna build a wall. So I'm kind of just looking at from the edge. And I did make this piece specifically for this demonstration so that it would be easy for me, honestly. And your molds might be much more complicated than this. This wall's barely gonna move. It's gonna be pretty straight across here. It's gonna like undulate just a little bit. But the walls of your molds might be much more complex. So. So I'm gonna turn this around, you guys can kind of see. You guys see this line I've drawn on here? Notice it's not straight down. I'm following the outermost point, right? If I look at it from the front or from the back, I basically, wherever the edge of it meets negative space, that's where I want that wall to be, okay? Because that represents like the outermost point of that side. Does that make sense? Yeah. Does that make sense? All right, so now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna build a wall on this side of that line, okay? And then I'm gonna apply plaster to this side. So I'm making a mold of this side first, and then next class, I'm gonna show you how to do the second side, okay? I'll do it much faster next time, because I won't have to walk you through as much as I'm walking you through right now. But yeah, so for the first thing I'm gonna do is just take fresh clay, and I'm gonna, I'll get some clay out here so you guys don't have to spend any of your own money on this. But we'll just get what's called old clay. So I'll donate a couple bags. We'll keep it in a container down here. I'll label it for you guys, and you can just use the clay that's out here. Make sure you keep it covered, so that way it doesn't get too hard. All right, so when I'm applying this clay, I'm pushing it right up against this. One thing I'm now remembering from previous semesters is that if this gets too dry, the clay won't stick to it, okay? So you gotta make sure that you actually add this first before it gets like late leather hard to bone dry. Definitely don't add the clay after you've added or sprayed the mold soap on, okay?
Is there a minimum thickness to the wall?
To the wall?
Yeah.
Well, so you don't want it to be too thin, because it needs to kind of like stay up. Your objects might change, or it might be smaller than this. This is probably definitely the largest of any scale object I hope you guys would try to make. You can make something about this size, maybe even a little bit larger, depending on what it is. You just have to talk to me about it first. It may or may not be appropriate. Might be like a little too tricky. Tell you what I'm gonna do. I need to actually wet this down a little bit. It's a little too dry, so I'm having a tough time sticking to it. So I'm gonna just take a little bit of a sponge, a damp sponge, and just rub that along that seam. So those of you who have made molds before, this is a really quick and less fussy, less complicated method than say if you're making molds for like slip casting. Those have a few more extra steps involved, making it quite challenging because those need to be very, very precise. We can be a little less precise with these. So I'm just applying this clay, just pinching it on, trying to get it right to that line that I drew on there. You can also make molds of just like fresh, wet clay. That's totally fine. The only problem I've had with that in the past is when I go to take the wall off, right? There's like separation line. It'll stick to the other clay and it can damage part of the item, right? So it's best if it's like leather hard. Kind of like, I like to apply the clay just behind the line a little bit, and then from the back side kind of like push it forward just to where it just meets it, rather than like put it over top and then push it back, because I can leave a little bit of clay or damage it accidentally when I'm doing this. Probably should just put a bigger board, but that's okay. All right, next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna kind of smooth this out. So I just got a rib. And it doesn't want to stick there, so I'm gonna stick a wet sponge and apply a little bit of water behind it for the stick. So I just like to flatten out this wall a little bit so it's not too lumpy, because I'm going to start applying plaster to this in a little bit, and it's better if this wall is smooth along here, because the more surface area, if it's like lumpy and stuff, the more surface area that's there, the more difficult it is to actually pull the molds apart. So like if you look at these commercial molds, you'll see they're all really, really smooth in between those molds, right? This area right here. So whatever surface this looks like, that plaster is going to go into that area, right? So if it's lumpy, the plaster is going to be lumpy, and I want to make sure I don't have any undercuts. So just smooth that over a little bit. If I can push it down to the piece, that's great. Good for a video that has skateboarders in the background. Well, skateboarders. Light them in. There's one to make a mold. Okay. All right, so. Hard part's done, all right? So I made my sculpture, applied my wall, divided it in half, right? So I know where my divine line is. Now I'm gonna go ahead and spray it with this, and I'm gonna make some, I'm gonna spray even this outer wall here. And this, again, this is really just to have a barrier between the object that you're making a mold of and the plaster, because the plaster wants to stick to everything, right? Those of you who worked with plaster before, it sticks to everything. So like, I wear clothes, I wear this outfit every day, right? If I get plaster on my clothes, I wore my really junky shoes today. I don't care. So wear your junky shoes, wear your junky shirt, wear your junky shorts, pants, whatever. Because it's a possibility, even if you get like one drop of plaster on it, you're gonna see that forever. You know? just really won't ever come out. So, the $5 t-shirts are the way to go. All right, so that has mold stuff on it. Next thing I need to do is I'm gonna make up plaster. I wanna make it up a little on the loose side or like kind of watery at first. I'm gonna brush it on using one of these chip brushes. Okay, I've got a bunch of these chip brushes. They're super cheap, so you know, if you need to use a new one, it's totally fine. So go ahead and get out. So we keep the plaster in this big tub down here, right below the table. Yeah. And that's just to keep the moisture out. So make sure you guys always return the lid. Make sure you put the lid on nice and tight because we don't want the plaster to harden and to weaken by any moisture, which obviously is not a big problem right now because we're in a drought. So what I'm gonna do is, actually I should put that up there. I'm just gonna apply a little bit of this. And what I like to do is, so I've got some ratios and some calculations for making very accurate plaster parts. So if you're making like slip casting parts like this, it's really important that you have your water to plaster ratio the same for all the parts because you need the slip to be absorbed in each part the same amount, right? So if you leave it sit for like 10 minutes, you want both sides of your cast to be the same thickness, right? You don't want a thick side and thin side. And if you have too much plaster or more plaster to water on one side, it's going to pull out more moisture than the other side. So you're going to have uneven casts. With this, we're going to kind of like just do like what I call the continent method, not the island method. You guys have all done the island method. The island method is where you just pour it in until you get a little island, right? Then you mix it up. I like the continent method. I like it to be a really large island. That's actually closer to the real true ratio.
We've been haunted.
All right, and so how I introduce plaster, I usually just do it like this. I'll squeeze it out. And once I introduce plaster, I can't stop. Can't stop, won't stop. You really want to just like let it fall into the water, like this. And once that plaster comes in contact with moisture or water, it starts to cure. Like there's a chemical reaction actually happening right now with the gypsum. No, I only care about the ratio, and I weigh out the plaster, and I have very specific volumes of water that I work with when I'm making slip cast molds. And I've got a chart for you guys to my office. I'll post it up out here. We moved this area. I had it posted in our last area.
Trying to remember what it's called, but isn't one of the glaze ingredients we have one of the earlier versions of the reactant they put in plaster? It's not soda ash, something like that though.
What was the question?
I
Ask that
think it
again.
was, I'm pretty sure like the soda ash we had. Which one were you pointing at that gets hot? Soda ash. Yeah, soda ash was one of the original versions of plaster reactant and concrete reactant. Have they replaced it since?
I don't think there's soda ash in this.
It wouldn't be. I think they replaced it with gypsum.
Yeah.
But for a while, like I know the Romans used a mix of ash and volcanic sand and a couple of other things to build their concrete because you can get that. They did it with lime. Actually, now that I think about it, they did lime from seashells. Which is part of why there was so strong. But
Yeah, there's also, I don't believe so now.
concrete does. I don't think. plaster
There are
does.
different kinds of plaster. So the plaster we like to use is called USG1, also known as pottery plaster. So like when you go to like ceramic stores or a lot of sculpture stores, you're gonna find USG1 is typically the most common. There's also plaster of Paris, right? Your little hobby kits at home.
Yeah. So I was wondering, how is this different from plaster of Paris?
How is it different than plaster of Paris? I'm not really sure. I know that the absorption's a little different. Plaster of Paris seems to be a lot more like closed, right? I don't know if it absorbs as much moisture as say USP 1. Alright, so this is starting to fill up. I don't have a continent yet, but that's for like thicker. I'm probably gonna stop adding here shortly. You can see I make a huge mess. So when you guys are doing this, you gotta do this up here on this table, right? This has a melamine top. We can clean it off. So I'm actually gonna brush on plaster first.
How do you know when it needs to bring down?
The continent method. So that's where you're introducing the plaster. I'm starting to get kind of full here. I'm wondering if I maybe had too much water in my container. Probably should have started off with less water. But, so when I'm doing this, I'm also squeezing out big chunks, right? And like I was starting to say earlier, once I introduce the plaster to the water, it starts to cure. So the plaster that I introduced like 2 minutes ago is already starting to thicken and harden up at the very bottom. But one of the things that I've found and I've heard from other people that do a lot of plaster work is that it's important not to actually stir it until you introduce all of your plaster. So yeah, if I'm making a slip cast mold, I've got very specific amount of water. I might have like, 3 cups of water, and then I have to weigh out the plaster. So I've got a chart for you guys. If you want to look at it, if you want to make a slip cast mold, because you want both sides to be identical. So both my sides are going to be kind of similar, but they're not going to be identical, obviously, because I'm just like eyeballing this. As they say, to taste. So I think I had about 3 liters. 3 liters of water, and it's getting really full. This is definitely a little bit more than I need for this part of the demo. But you can see how it's starting to kind of get the continent going here. Sinking back in. There it goes. Means I can do a little bit more. And when I'm introducing this, you see how I'm spreading it all over the bucket? I'm not just putting it in one spot, right? Spreading it around. This might be my last scoop. See, I'm starting to get the islands. And I'm gonna just call it here. Because my bucket's getting full. So I gotta stick my hand here to actually stir it. Once I do that, it's gonna rise up. I'm gonna make it raise up a mess. Alright, so I got a nice little island there. I could add another scoop, but I'm kind of like out of space. So I'm gonna go ahead. Oh yeah. Can you hand me that measuring cup there at the top? I need to decant just a little bit of this off. Thanks. So once you use an item for plaster, you can't really use it for anything else. Plaster and clay are like not friends in the kilns. Oops. So, yeah, make a mess. Oh, I hate making messes. Plaster will cause pop-outs. So we like to keep the clay and plaster very separate, right? So this can never go into like our class. I never do plaster work inside the classroom because we don't even want like a little bit of plaster if that gets into our reclaim. It can cause explosions in the piece once it's being fired. So, all right, great. This is fantastic. Okay, so it's thickening up really nicely. It's not heating up yet, but I'm sure it will soon. It'll start heating up because it's going through a chemical reaction. It's starting to cure. Once it starts to heat up, that means it's starting to cure.
Exothermic reactions. Good fun.
What's that?
Exothermic reactions.
Exothermic, yes. Thank you. Word of the day.
Well, I think the thing that scares me with both plaster and concrete is that heat is coming from the fact that it is chemically melting pieces together, which is why you can't undo concrete and plaster.
Correct. All right. So, I'm actually at a spot where I'm interested in starting to paint this on. It's at the right consistency. If I let it go too long, it's going to be way too thick for me to paint it on. I do want it to be thick so I can start to glob it on here shortly. But for right now, I'm going to wash my hand off. I've got a bucket over here. We never want to put plaster in the sink. Okay? It's really bad for the plumbing. So this is our plaster washing bucket. One thing I forgot to do before I put my hand in the plaster was I usually like to put on Bag Balm or Aquaphor just to like kind of like protect my skin because plaster really dries you out. If any of you have like eczema, you'll definitely want to put something on before you put your hands in plaster. All right, so the plaster is definitely thickening up. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to just start applying it. Starting at the top and kind of let it drip down. But this is, I want to do a nice fluid application with like the plaster before it gets too thick and starts to really cure because this way it can really get into all the little nooks and crannies. I'm going to get a lot of the detail. So that's what's great also about using plaster for making molds is it's really great about catching all of the detail. And if you put the plaster on once it's like too thick, you're gonna get some like air bubbles usually in there, and it's not gonna capture all of the little nuances of the surface. So I've probably got about another 4 or 5 minutes till this is ready. We'll find out. I wasn't very accurate in measuring it. And I'm doing this awkwardly just so you guys can see it. I would normally be doing this toward me, so don't do this in the motion. I'm doing it. I'm just doing it so you guys can see it. This might be an undercut, but we'll find out. You can see here at the top that the plaster is already starting to dry a little bit, which is good. Again, we don't want to use anything you use with plaster. Like it's plaster owns it, you know, from there on out. So like these little chip brushes, I got a bunch of them. Don't use any of our good fancy like glaze brushes. Make sure you use these little cheapies. Go back up here to the top. If there's any areas I missed. And I'm going to keep brushing this on until it gets too thick for me to really brush on. And once it becomes too thick for me to brush on, then I'm going to start applying it by hand. Start scooping it up out of here. But you can see this definitely makes a mess, right? So, you know, I got a little bit there, so I'm going to have a plaster shirt now forever.
You can just nail it on this side. Towards like a little bit more. Right there.
Right there? Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you guys see this getting thicker? It's important that you do this coat first instead of just globbing it on. You just glob it on again, you're going to lose some detail, and there's a possibility it doesn't really want to stay. One other thing I would do differently for like the next time for like the other half, I'm on a way too small of a base. I should have got a larger board. No, it's gonna be okay. I'm kind of already committed to this. I've already got plaster on it. And you guys can make like really more like clean, pristine objects. Like this is a very like rough. Like I kind of, I don't know. In my making process right now, I'm really kind of starting to explore more of like the really you know the evidence of the hand, I guess, or the evidence of the material. I'm really interested in like showing the material for what it is a little bit more instead of like cleaning it up too much. That's just like kind of where I am in my making. And some of you guys that are more interested in like really clean, crisp objects, you know, this is also a really great place to like work on that. Because you can really, this skateboarding is going to come out really well in this video, I guarantee it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I know a lot of artists that cast their objects because they like their objects to be like hyper crafted. They to be super clean. They like the thickness of the whole entire object to be the same, right? There can be, you know, presence about an object if it's all slip cast. I think slip castings are a great way to go. Or casting in general is a great way to go for really like clean work. So kind of having fun with kind of like turning that on its head a little bit by making something a little more sloppy looking, but there's still, you know, pretty involved process behind it.
So what kind of casting is this?
This is a press mold.
Press mold.
Yeah, so I'll make this half, and then on next class, on Monday, I'll pull this off, and I'll leave the object inside of this, and then I'll pour plaster on this side, do exactly what we're doing right now, and then pull it apart, and I can take slabs and push that in, and I can make multiples of that. And another great thing about this, making press molds, is you can explore different clays, right? So I can make a porcelain version of this. I can make a chocolate stoneware version of this. I can make a cinnamon version of this, you know, and really kind of like play with that a lot. So I think that's something really interesting. Yeah, so I'm gonna keep it under plastic. It's kind of a long time, like 5 days, I guess. I'm a little worried about that, honestly. Yeah, you're right. But that's what we're doing. The schedule I kind of gave myself. Yeah, I really feel my hands like really dry right now. Yeah, ideally I do this all in one day, or at least the plaster part. So like in between, like, you know, I still have to wait for this to firm up a little bit, apply it, and then it's probably a good hour, maybe not an hour, almost an hour, probably till I can apply the second part. So you can totally do this in one class period if you have your piece ready.
And if you do that, would you make one batch of plaster, or happen to need an hour?
Yeah, you can't mix the second part because it'll be solid as rock before it's ready. Yeah, you can only do one side at a time. So, and there's a lot more rules to using plaster than you know, once you start mixing, you're not really supposed to add more plaster. But honestly, for press molds, it's totally fine. All right, so yeah, bag bomb just kind of helps protect the skin a little bit. This is still pretty cold. One thing I didn't do, I just used water straight out of the hose right here. If you can get like tepid water, like lukewarm water, it's gonna go a little faster. In fact, I'll say this. Let me go ahead and pause. We'll do a two-parter.